Good evening, everyone. It's fantastic to be in Bonn. You know, it's an amazing city. People are so friendly and helpful. I've been really blown away by the people here. It's wonderful. And I met a woman at the Bahnhof today who was saying that she was very disturbed about the accumulation of elite plutocratic power in the world. She didn't put it in those words. But it's actually one of those serendipitous things, because that's kind of what I want to get at with my talk today, really. I want to talk about patterns of injustice and how law relates to that. So we've been talking about young people and justice and climate change, and I think climate change is the greatest issue of justice, of human justice, that we currently face on the planet. It's a crisis of human hierarchy, if it's anything at all. Now, when I was 17, I used to do that thing of sitting at my bedroom window, kind of agonizing about the difference I could see between the kind of comfortable life I had and the images that I saw at that age of places in Africa. And I used to sort of really want to do something about it. And I had this deep sense, I think maybe many of us in the room share, that there is something fundamentally wrong, isn't there, with the way that things are set up. And so because I really was passionate about justice, I studied law. I know it's naive, right? Because actually since then I've come to realize that there's an intimate relationship between law and the patterns and production of injustice. And that's what I want to talk about tonight. I want to talk about the DNA of law and law's complicity, and that's the right word, I think, in the production of the unjust, unbalanced world order that we currently live in and struggle with. Now, this journey began for me when I read an amazing book called The Future of Human Rights by a brilliant Indian scholar called Descartes Bacon. And what Bacon was arguing was that this universal human rights, which are, for those of you that don't know, but I'm sure you do, you're such a sophisticated audience, that's the order of rights that fundamentally looks at prerequisites for human well-being. It's about human vulnerability, human dignity, embodied need. You couldn't get closer to the flesh and blood of the human being, in theory, than you do in international human rights law. And Descartes Bacon argues that this order of rights has been critically appropriated, colonized, by immense formations of global corporate capital. And he develops this thesis, and one of the examples he gives, for example, is that the human right to health somehow became translated into the right of pharmaceutical companies to have big IP monopolies, or the human right to food somehow became the right of 4 large agribusinesses to dominate the entire global food supply, and so on. And his basic bottom line argument is that some of our most cherished human rights have become forced into a dependence for their realization on a prior order of rights for global capital. And that this prior order of rights for global capital is deeply destructive of the human rights of human beings everywhere. So I was really a bit taken aback by this. You know, and if you ask the average person at the average British bus stop, which I sometimes do because I'm a bit of a liability, quite frankly, about corporate human rights, they'll say, well, they're not even human, are they? They're not even human beings. And there's a fundamentally intuitive insight there. So I was really intrigued, you know, what is it about, you know, law that makes corporate human rights seem so natural to the legal system and so odd to the rest of us? And so I dug down, and to cut a very long analysis short, what I discovered is that deep in the DNA of law, there is a particular vision, allegedly us. But this vision is a template of a human being. It's ultimately the rational man, but disembodied. And in fact, you could argue that the rationality of the legal person, in some fundamental sense, depends on its disembodiment. Now I hear you gasp as one. My goodness sake, this is hardly human at all. Correct. It is not. The legal person is like a persona or a mask. It doesn't fit us. And this strange disembodied something that is this hyper-rational reasoner of law, which is meant to stand for all of us, actually stands for none of us. Although, I've got to add a caveat, there is a body sneakily embedded in the disembodiment of the legal person. And that body is the body of the historically dominant human being, the European, rationalistic, white, property-owning man. And actually, if you dig down under the surface of laws human, you don't find a woman. You don't find a black man, because those humans don't fit this ideological template of law's ideal human, this perfect, rational, disembodied person. But guess what does fit it? And this is where my research got really exciting. The corporate form fits it perfectly. The corporation is a disembodied entity. It exemplifies a property-centered rationalism. And it is, in a sense, the quintessential manifestation of those ideological commitment at the center of the legal system to this disembodied rationality. And you can see that come together when you think for a minute about the history of colonialism, because there, European rationalistic supremacy drove through the power of the early transnational corporation to grasp vast tracts of land, destroy indigenous communities, destroy their epistemologies and their visions of knowledge and life. And that colonial order, ladies and gentlemen, is at the foundation of today's international legal system. The global states, the states of the global north ensured that that was the case. So is it any wonder then, in the light of that, that the entire international legal order is dominated by massive conglomerations of transnational corporate power that exploit their disembodiment to escape jurisdictional control and operate as the perfect cloaking device, if you'll excuse a bit of Star Trek language, the perfect cloaking device for the accumulation of immense, unaccountable, elite, unforgivable levels of power? Law's DNA is thoroughly complicit, in other words, in the trajectory that we now see in the global order. A logic is working itself out. This is not an accident. This is not random. There is a logic working itself out. So my question is, how can law be the answer, actually, unless its most foundational assumptions are questioned and turned over? And actually, we can link this to the greatest source of injustice in the world today, arguably climate change. If we step back a bit further and we go to the mind-body split of Descartes and the scientific method of Francis Bacon, which came together to produce the literal objectification, turning into the object of the living order itself, what Carolyn Merchant famously calls the death of nature. And we can link those very same values to the objectification and exploitation of non-dominant humans. All those humans who have been regarded as less than fully rational, note the connection, throughout the history of the legal system. I'm talking about the non-white, the non-male, the non-property owning, particularly the nomadic, the indigenous, the less able, and so on and so forth, all considered to be less fully human than the quintessential trope of the human at the heart of the rationalistic legal order. And we can link that as well by pulling in Descartes and Bacon to the immense, at least since the arrival of industrial capitalism, the immense imposition of suffering on uncountable numbers of animals and the wholesale destruction of ecosystems. In other words, we can join the dots between the DNA of law and some of its central assumptions and the tilted nature of the global order as we face it today. Now, if that's bleak, I'm afraid that's what you get for inviting a critical legal scholar to address a TEDx. There is some hope, though, and hope lies in exactly what we've been talking about, the personal, and it lies in the embodied. So in place of the top-down disembodied conceptions of law, we see all over the planet embodied, breathing, living relationships between human beings in a new worldwide commons-based movement. It is literally exploding across the planet as we sit here tonight. So you've got wonderful urban agriculture movements with people planting free food all over their cities for everyone to enjoy. That's what we've been doing in Bristol with Bristol Incredible Edible. You've got Indigenous women seed swapping to break market dependencies and monocultural weaknesses that have grabbed their communities because of the way that we've set up the productivist food paradigm. We've got digital commons. We've got a sharing economy. And this is human scale personal stuff. This is stuff that you and I, in our cities, in Bonn, in Bristol, wherever we happen to be, this is the stuff that we can do with our neighbours. It brings us as embodied beings right back into the frame of agency. It changes the information-action ratio. It's wonderful. But there is a problem, which is that the top-down hegemonic system is going to fight back, and you can see it happening. You can see, farmers being sued for using traditional seeds instead of the Terminator seed from the large agricultural business, and so on. So here's my really important question that I want to put out there tonight. Can we re-engineer the corporate legal form? Can we link corporate action and corporate responsibility in a way that actually holds these giants to account? Can we bring them to an altogether more human scale? Can we disaggregate them? Can we make it more difficult for them to evade jurisdictional accountability? Because unless we do not have agency in the way that we'd like over the large system, no matter what we do in the small systems, as it were. But I insist that these small systems, these embodied relationships from flesh and blood, these are where hope lies. Because law, one of its failures is it's hierarchical, it's rigid, it's binary, it likes taxonomies. The world is complex. Climate change is immensely complex. Can you think of anything more complex than all the systems involved in climate change? Law itself needs to be transformed, and it has to become complexity sensitive. We need legal scholars to theorize it. But you know what? In the meantime, you and I, in our locations, in our embodied relationships, we can model a different kind of relationship. We can model an eco-wise, mutually compassionate, generous world, and I think that's a world worth fighting for. Thank you.